I should have known better, honestly. A free couch on Craigslist? It sounded too good to be true. But I was a broke college student, desperate for any furniture to make my new place feel more like a home. I'd spent my last dime on moving in, so when I saw the ad for a gently used brown couch, listed as free if you can pick it up, it felt like a godsend. The ad was straightforward. The couch looked cozy and slightly worn in, the kind you'd find in a family room. I imagined curling up on it with a blanket after a long day, maybe even hosting a couple of friends for movie nights. I could already picture it, right against the wall of my living room. The man who posted the ad, Gary, responded quickly to my message. His response was short and polite. "Come by after 6 p.m. It's in my basement. Just ring the doorbell." The word basement gave me pause, but I figured it was just one of those quirks that come with Craigslist deals. I mean, where else would someone keep an old couch they wanted to get rid of? Besides, his reply didn't seem suspicious, and he even sent me an address. The house was in a residential part of town, not too far from campus. There were plenty of houses around. It seemed safe enough. After classes, I called a friend, Hannah, to see if she'd come with me, but she had a work shift. She laughed when I told her where I was going and said, "Try not to get murdered, okay?" I laughed it off. But as I drove over, I couldn't shake a tiny nagging feeling that maybe I should have waited until someone could go with me. Still, it was just a couch. The house was in an older neighborhood, where trees arched over the streets, creating a green tunnel as I drove through. The house itself was unremarkable, a little run down, but in the way you'd expect from someone who didn't have time to fuss over it. Faded paint, a few weeds in the yard. It looked like a lot of houses in my own neighborhood. I parked my car, checked the address one last time, and walked up to the front door. I rang the doorbell, and almost immediately, the door opened. A man in his late 50s or early 60s stood there, tall and thin, with wisps of gray hair sticking out from under a baseball cap. He wore a plaid shirt and a pair of jeans that seemed a size too big. His face was friendly, his smile wide, but not overly so. "Hi, you must be here for the couch," he said, stepping aside to let me in. His voice was raspy, like he'd been smoking for years. "Yes, thank you so much for offering it up," I said, trying to hide the nervous edge in my voice. He chuckled. "Not a problem. I just hate seeing good furniture go to waste. It's down in the basement. I hope that's okay?" "Of course," I replied, feeling a little silly for being on edge. He seemed nice, even a bit grandfatherly. I'd been picturing some dingy, dark basement, but the main part of the house looked well kept, albeit dated. The carpet was a faded green, and the walls were covered in wallpaper with tiny blue flowers. "Right this way," he said, gesturing toward a door at the end of the hall. He opened it and flicked on a light, revealing a narrow set of stairs leading down. The light was weak, barely illuminating the concrete steps, but I could see a soft glow at the bottom. As I descended, the smell of musty air hit me. It was a typical basement scent, thick and a little damp. I reminded myself that I'd come this far, and that the couch would be worth it. Halfway down the stairs, I glanced back, noticing that Gary was following close behind me. I couldn't help but tense up, suddenly aware of how isolated this basement was. We reached the bottom, and I turned to take in the room. The basement was larger than I'd expected, filled with old furniture covered in sheets. It looked more like a storage space than a finished room. In the far corner, I spotted the brown couch, exactly as pictured. It was positioned awkwardly, facing a bare concrete wall. "There it is," he said, his voice close behind me. I forced myself to relax. I could hear the faint hum of a dehumidifier and noticed a couple of small windows at the top of the walls. They were dusty, almost completely blocked by cobwebs, but the fact that there was some natural light made me feel better. I walked over to the couch and ran my hand over the armrest. It was softer than I'd expected, with a bit of wear, but otherwise in good condition. "This is great," I said, genuinely thrilled. "Glad you like it," Gary replied. "Think you can handle getting it upstairs?" I hesitated, looking at the narrow staircase and realizing it would be difficult to carry the couch by myself. "Would you mind helping me?" He smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Of course, but I'll need you to grab the other end and lift," as I guided up. We maneuvered the couch, him at the front and me holding the back, grunting as we tried to angle it up the stairs. It was heavier than it looked, and every step was a struggle. Halfway up, I noticed that the door at the top of the stairs had been left open, until, suddenly, it wasn't. It closed with a quiet, almost sinister finality. I glanced up, but Gary didn't seem to notice or care. So I told myself it was probably the draft from the open windows. We reached the top of the stairs, and as we pushed the couch into the hallway, Gary turned to me. His expression was different, his friendly smile replaced by something colder. "Actually," he began, his voice low, "I just realized there's something else down there you might be interested in. It's a matching chair." "Oh?" I said, feigning interest, even as my skin prickled with unease. "Yep, it's right in the back corner. I forgot to bring it up, but it's yours if you want it." I glanced back down the dark stairwell, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. I didn't want to go back down there. I already had the couch, and that was more than enough. But I didn't want to seem rude or ungrateful. "Oh, I think the couch is enough, really," I said, smiling politely. He didn't respond, just stared at me with that blank, unsettling look. His gaze flickered from my face to the basement stairs, then back to me. "Are you sure?" he asked, voice barely a whisper now. There was something in his eyes, a strange glint that made me shiver. "It's just sitting there, waiting." I'm sure," I replied, my voice shaking despite my best effort to stay calm. "But thank you." For a second, he didn't move. Then slowly he turned and walked past me, toward the front door. I followed him, relieved to be out of the basement and eager to leave. As I reached the door, I glanced back, and my heart skipped a beat. The basement door was open again, just a crack, and in the dimness, I thought I saw movement. I blinked, my mind racing, trying to rationalize what I'd just seen. Maybe it was a shadow, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I wanted to believe that, desperately. "Well, thank you again," I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice betrayed me. Gary didn't respond, just nodded and closed the front door behind me without another word. Once I was safely in my car, I sat there for a moment, heart pounding. The image of that dark stairwell still burned in my mind. I sat in my car for a few seconds, breathing hard, the unsettling feeling still gnawing at me. I kept replaying those last few moments in my mind. Gary's eyes, the strange way he insisted I go back down for the chair, and that glimpse of something moving in the basement. It was nothing, I tried to tell myself. Just nerves. But still, a chill lingered. I started the car and pulled away from the house, glancing in the rearview mirror as I did. Gary stood on the front porch, watching me drive off. I kept my eyes on the road, determined to put as much distance as I could between myself and that house. When I got back to my apartment, I was almost embarrassed by how freaked out I felt. After all, I'd gotten what I came for, a free couch. I should have been happy. I had everything I'd hoped for. My new place was coming together, and I had a cozy spot to unwind. I pushed the memories of the visit out of my mind, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. That night, I decided to try out the couch, settling in with a blanket and a book. The couch was comfortable, softer than I'd expected. I began to relax, letting go of the tension I'd been carrying since I left Gary's house. But as I settled deeper into the cushions, I became aware of a strange smell. Musty, like old wood and stale air. The same smell I'd noticed in the basement. I dismissed it at first. Maybe it was just something lingering from Gary's place. I'd give it a clean in the morning. But as I kept reading, I couldn't ignore it. The smell wasn't just musty. It had an almost metallic edge to it, like the smell of rust or blood. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. The smell grew stronger, so strong that I finally put down my book and leaned forward to take a closer sniff. That's when I noticed something strange. In the dim light, the fabric around the seams looked darker, almost damp. I jumped up, feeling my skin crawl. I turned on my phone's flashlight and shined it over the couch, examining every inch. As the light swept over the seat, something caught my eye. A small, dark stain in the middle of one of the cushions. I leaned in, squinting, my heart pounding as I realized what it looked like. Blood. It couldn't be, I told myself. But as I inspected further, I found more stains, small but unmistakable, scattered across the cushions and armrests. And suddenly, I felt something deep inside the cushion shift, like there was something embedded within. My hands shook as I pulled back the cushion cover. Underneath, the fabric was torn and haphazardly stitched, as if someone had tried to repair it, without really caring about appearances. Carefully, I tugged at the stitching, feeling the fabric rip easily. I peeled it back and gasped, stumbling backward. Inside the cushion, half buried in the foam, were tufts of hair. Dark, matted hair. And there, scattered in the stuffing, were more stains, darker and more ominous than the ones on the surface. I dropped the cushion, a surge of nausea overtaking me. My mind reeled. I needed to get this thing out of my apartment immediately. I grabbed the edge of the couch and dragged it across the floor, desperate to get it to the curb. But as I struggled to push it through the door, I heard a faint clinking sound from inside one of the armrests. Curiosity and dread gnawed at me. Against my better judgment, I leaned down and looked closer, pressing my fingers along the seam. There was something hard inside, something metallic. I felt around the armrest until I found a small slit, like a pocket. My fingers grazed a cold metal object. I pulled it out, my hands shaking, and found myself holding a rusted old key. Why would there be a key hidden inside a couch? And to what? Every instinct told me to throw it all away, to put the couch on the curb and forget I ever went to Gary's house. But my curiosity won out. Before I knew it, I was sitting on the floor, Googling the address I'd been to earlier, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain the strange things I'd found in that couch. After a few minutes of searching, I found a news article from about 5 years ago. The headline read, "Local woman missing in suspected abduction from home." My stomach dropped as I scanned the article. The address was Gary's house. The missing woman was described as having dark, shoulder-length hair. Her disappearance had been a mystery, with no leads or suspects ever identified. I sat back, a cold sweat breaking out on my skin. Was it possible that I shook my head, unable to complete the thought. But it all lined up. The hair, the stains, the hidden key. I was holding pieces of someone's life, or their death. inside that couch. I wanted to call the police, to tell someone, but what could I say? That I'd found a creepy old couch with a key and some hair in it? They'd think I was insane. I wasn't even sure I believed it myself. Instead, I wrapped the key in a cloth and hid it at the back of a drawer, not sure what else to do. That night, sleep was out of the question. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Gary's face, that blank stare, the strange glint in his eyes as he'd asked me to go back down to the basement. I kept hearing his words. It's just sitting there, waiting. At around 3 a.m, I heard a noise, a scraping sound coming from the living room. I sat up, my heart racing, straining to listen. The noise was faint, like something dragging slowly across the floor. I crept out of bed, gripping my phone tightly. As I neared the living room, the sound grew louder. I reached the doorway, peeking around the corner, and there, in the darkness, I saw it. The couch had moved. It was angled slightly toward the hallway, as if something had shifted it in my direction. I felt a chill creep over me, my body frozen in place. Then, from within the couch, I heard a faint, muffled voice. It was soft, barely a whisper, but it was there. It sounded like a woman, pleading, desperate. Help! Me! I bolted, running out of my apartment into the hallway, not stopping until I was outside in the cool night air. I called the police, finally unable to keep quiet any longer. When they arrived, I told them everything. I showed them the stains, the hair, and the key. They listened, their expressions grave, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. The officers took the couch and promised to investigate, though I could tell they weren't convinced. Days passed, and I heard nothing. My calls to the precinct were met with polite but dismissive responses. Then, about a week later, I got a call from a detective. His voice was serious, almost grim. They had traced the key to a storage unit rented in Gary's name. Inside, they found evidence linking him to the missing woman and, horrifyingly, to 2 other unsolved cases from the area. Gary had been using Craigslist to lure his victims, offering free furniture to get them alone. The couch had been his hiding place, his twisted secret. They never found Gary. He'd vanished before the police could question him, leaving behind nothing but the haunted memories and the terrible things hidden inside that couch. I never used Craigslist again, and I never took anything free from a stranger's house. Because now, I understood what my friend had said, half-jokingly, before I left that day. Sometimes, you really can get murdered over a free couch. I remember the ad clearly. It was simple, clean, and looked professional, a rarity on Craigslist. The headline read, "Aspiring models needed for free photo shoot. Build your portfolio." I was just starting out, trying to build my modeling career, with practically zero budget. I needed any professional shots I could get, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. The photographer, Steve, had even included samples of his work. They were beautiful. Portraits of women in soft lighting, some outdoor shots, some studio. His style was artsy without being weird, and his models looked elegant and strong. The ad said he had over a decade of experience, and that he was willing to help aspiring models for free. For someone like me, that was a dream come true. I emailed him right away, introducing myself and asking if he had any available slots. He replied within the hour, and we set up a time for the following Saturday. The shoot would take place at his studio in an industrial part of town, but he reassured me it was a large open space with lots of natural light. I'd never been to that part of town, but I wasn't worried. Professional photos were worth the trek. When Saturday arrived, I dressed in simple jeans and a t-shirt, with a few changes of clothes in a duffel bag. I took an Uber to the address he provided and arrived at a plain, windowless building nestled between a few warehouses. I hesitated when I got out, but Steve was already waiting outside, waving at me with a friendly smile. He was in his early 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked professional, exactly like what I'd imagined. "Hey, so glad you could make it," he said, extending a hand. I shook it, relieved by his warm demeanor. "Thanks for having me. This place is cool," I said, looking up at the nondescript building. "Yeah, it doesn't look like much from the outside, but the inside is great for lighting," he explained, guiding me in. "It's perfect for natural shots." I followed him through a metal door, which led to a surprisingly spacious interior. There were lights set up, big white backdrop sheets, and even a dressing area with a vanity mirror. The place looked like a legitimate studio, and I felt a thrill of excitement. This was a real chance to get some quality shots for my portfolio. "So we'll start with some basics," Steve said, grabbing his camera. "I'll have you do a few standard poses to warm up, and we'll go from there." The first part of the shoot went well. Steve was professional, giving clear directions, adjusting the lights, and moving around to get different angles. He was friendly without being overly talkative, and I felt like I was in good hands. After about 30 minutes, he suggested a break. "Why don't you change into something a little more formal?" he said, gesturing toward my duffel bag. "There's a private room back there if you need it." I nodded and went to change. The space was a small, dark room with a curtain instead of a door, but it was private enough. I slipped into a dress I'd brought and returned to the main area, where he had rearranged the backdrop. He'd put up a different set, making it look like a dimly lit room with rich red fabric draped everywhere. The tone of the shoot shifted. He asked me to do edgier poses, with a bit of a darker vibe. I wasn't used to this style, but I went along with it. His instructions were clear, and he adjusted the lighting to create dramatic shadows across my face and body. I felt a little uneasy as he got closer with the camera, but he was the professional, so I told myself to just go with it. After another set of shots, Steve asked if I would be interested in something a bit more artistic. His eyes had a strange glint to them, a little too intense, but I was young and eager to make a good impression, so I nodded. "Sure. What did you have in mind?" He walked over to a dusty corner of the studio, where I noticed a strange old wooden box, about 6 feet long and narrow, resting against the wall. It looked like something you'd see in a horror movie, a makeshift coffin or a long storage crate. The wood was cracked and darkened with age. "This is one of my props," he explained. "It's a bit creepy, but I think it could make for some really dramatic shots." I felt my stomach flip. The coffin, or whatever it was, looked unsettling, but Steve's demeanor was calm, encouraging. "You'd just be lying inside it, looking up at the camera. I promise, it'll look really unique." I hesitated, my instincts telling me that this was pushing it, but I also didn't want to look inexperienced or difficult to work with. I took a deep breath and nodded. "All right, let's try it." He smiled. "Great. Just lie down, and I'll adjust the lighting around you." I climbed into the box, shivering as my back pressed against the cold wood. The interior smelled faintly of dust and something else, something metallic. My pulse quickened as I lay down, staring up at the ceiling. The wood was close around me, claustrophobic. Steve adjusted the lights, casting strange shadows across my face. He leaned over me, his face close to mine. "This is going to be amazing," he said, his eyes gleaming. He took a few shots, the camera clicking as he moved from side to side, hovering just above me. "Okay, now close your eyes," he whispered, his voice softer, almost coaxing. I obeyed, my eyelids fluttering shut. But the silence that followed felt too long, stretching uncomfortably. I opened my eyes to find Steve still standing there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Actually," he murmured, "this next shot would look better if the lid were closed. Just for a moment. It'll create the perfect effect." I tensed. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice shook slightly. "Oh, it's fine. Just for a second," he insisted, reaching for the lid. Before I could protest, he began lowering it. The lid was heavy, and it creaked as it closed over me, blocking out the light. I was plunged into total darkness, trapped in a narrow, suffocating space. My heart raced as I listened to the faint sounds of his footsteps outside the box. The camera clicked, once, twice, then stopped. The silence pressed in around me. I waited, expecting him to lift the lid any second, but the seconds stretched into a minute, then another. I felt a surge of panic and tried to push the lid open, but it wouldn't budge. "Steve?" I called, my voice tight with fear. "Can you let me out now?" No answer, just silence. I pounded on the inside of the box, my breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. "Steve, let me out!" Still nothing. I pressed my ear against the side of the box, straining to hear any sign of movement. That's when I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. I held my breath, listening as the sound grew closer, stopping just outside the box. "Steve?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The silence hung in the air, thick and oppressive. Then suddenly, I heard a voice, soft and unsettlingly calm, coming from outside the box. "You're going to look perfect in my collection," he murmured. A chill ran down my spine as his words sank in. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. I'd walked into his studio, a complete stranger, and allowed him to lock me in a coffin-like box. I was trapped, with no one knowing where I was. Desperation took over. I clawed at the lid, pressing my weight against it, trying anything to break free. My nails scratched against the wood, but it didn't budge. I screamed, hoping someone would hear me, but the walls were thick, and there was no one around. Time blurred as I continued to pound, my fists aching. I didn't know how long I'd been trapped when I heard the faint sound of a door creaking open, followed by hurried footsteps. My heart leaped. Someone was here. "Help!" I screamed, my voice hoarse. "Please, help me!" The footsteps stopped right outside the box, and I heard a voice. A different one this time. A woman's voice, shaking with fear. "Oh my God. Is someone in there?" "Yes. Please, let me out." The lid flew open, and I was greeted by the shocked face of a young woman, her wide eyes taking in the sight of me inside the box. She reached out, helping me scramble out of the confined space, and I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. We didn't stick around. She pulled me to my feet, and together, we bolted out of the studio, down the stairs, and into the street. Only when we were a safe distance away did she explain that she'd come for a photo shoot as well. But when she arrived, she'd seen Steve leaving the building in a hurry. Curious and unsettled, she'd come inside and heard my screams. Later, I went to the police, giving them Steve's name, the address, and a description. But by the time they investigated, he was long gone. His studio was empty, stripped of all the equipment and the strange box. They found nothing to prove he'd ever been there. To this day, I can still feel the suffocating weight of that box, the darkness pressing down on me. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I swear I can hear the faint click of a camera lens, capturing me from somewhere just out of sight. It was supposed to be simple. I'd planned a 6-month trip abroad and needed to sublet my apartment while I was gone. Rent in the city was outrageous, and I couldn't afford to keep paying for a place I wasn't living in. Craigslist seemed like an obvious choice, so I posted the listing and, within a few days, had a handful of responses. Most of them were flaky or didn't fit the vibe I was looking for, until I met Tom. Tom seemed perfect. He was quiet, polite, and worked as a graphic designer, which meant he'd be busy and, hopefully, not throwing parties in my absence. He even came across as a little shy, which I found reassuring. We met up. He seemed totally normal, and he agreed to pay the rent up front in cash. My instincts didn't throw any red flags, so I handed over the keys and left on my adventure. The first few weeks were bliss. I checked in with Tom over email just to make sure everything was going smoothly, and his replies were short and to the point. Everything was fine, he said, and I had nothing to worry about. I was halfway across the world, living my dream, and barely gave the arrangement another thought. Around the 2-month mark, though, things started to get strange. My building manager reached out to tell me they'd seen a man sneaking around my place at odd hours. He'd even received complaints from neighbors about weird noises coming from my apartment late at night. Whispering, strange humming, and occasional loud bangs. At first, I assumed Tom was just having friends over, maybe working on some late-night design projects. But when I reached out to him, he didn't reply. Days went by, then weeks, and still nothing. His silence started to gnaw at me. I convinced myself he was just busy, though, and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. By the time I got back to the States, I was relieved to be home. My trip had been amazing, but I couldn't wait to get back into my own bed, to be in my own space again. I arrived at the apartment early in the morning, my suitcase trailing behind me as I fumbled with the keys, anticipation mixing with an odd feeling of dread. When I opened the door, I was hit by a wave of stale, musty air. The apartment was dark, the blinds drawn tightly shut. The living room looked different. Most of my things were where I'd left them, but the furniture was rearranged in a way that felt wrong, almost invasive. A layer of dust had settled over everything, as if no one had cleaned in months. I called out, "Tom?" Silence. I moved through the apartment, and every step I took felt heavier than the last. I found more changes, tiny, unnerving alterations that were hard to pinpoint, but impossible to ignore. My bookshelves were in disarray, as if someone had pulled books out and put them back in the wrong order. Small items were missing from my dresser, things I knew I'd left there. My bed was made, but the sheets were wrinkled, as if someone had been sleeping in them without caring to straighten them out. In the kitchen, I opened a cabinet and found strange food items I'd never buy. Cans of sardines, jars of pickled vegetables, odd herbal teas. The fridge was filled with things I didn't recognize, and the expiration dates were months old. "Tom," I called again, but I knew somehow that he was gone. The apartment felt empty, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of emptiness that felt like it had been filled with something dark, something heavy. As I walked down the hallway to my bedroom, I noticed a strange, sour smell. It was faint, but unmistakable, and it grew stronger as I approached the door. I hesitated, heart pounding, and then pushed the door open. Inside, my bedroom was completely transformed. The walls were covered in photos of me, Photos I didn't remember taking. Photos I could swear I'd never seen before. Some were of me at work, others of me running errands, sitting in my car, even looking out the window of my own apartment. They were taken at odd angles, as if someone had been watching me from a distance. Each photo was meticulously taped to the wall in a precise grid. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, covering every inch of wall space, creating a grotesque collage of my life as seen through someone else's eyes. I backed out of the room, my stomach twisting with fear and revulsion. As I stumbled back into the hallway, I noticed something else. An odor, sharp and acrid, coming from the bathroom. I pushed open the bathroom door and immediately froze. The mirror was smeared with black marker, strange symbols and messages scrawled across the glass in jagged, chaotic lines. I couldn't understand any of it. It looked like a foreign language, or maybe something he'd made up. But in the center, in shaky, almost childlike handwriting, was a message. I'm not alone when I'm with you. I took a step back, horrified, my heart racing. The bathroom sink was filled with hair, long strands, dark and matted. My hair. It looked like he'd been collecting it, possibly from my hairbrush, or maybe even my shower drain. The thought of him handling my things, of him knowing so much about me, made my skin crawl. Panicked, I grabbed my phone and dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail. I called again and again, leaving messages each time, demanding that he explain himself, that he tell me what the hell he'd been doing in my home. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't get a response. I called the police next, and they arrived quickly. I explained everything, showed them the photos, the messages, the hair in the sink. They took my statement, assured me they'd file a report, but it was clear they didn't know what to do. After all, Tom hadn't committed any clear crime. He'd simply been there, lurking in the shadows of my life. Over the next few days, I tried to go back to normal, but the apartment never felt the same. No matter how much I cleaned, how many items I threw away, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left some part of himself behind. I didn't sleep in my bedroom. I could barely bring myself to go in there at all. A week later, I received a strange envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside, I found a single Polaroid photo of my bedroom. It was taken at night, the lights off, but the image was unmistakable. My bed, my furniture, all exactly as I'd left it. And in the center of the photo, standing in the dark with his back to the camera, was Tom. My blood ran cold as I realized the photo had been taken after I'd returned home. I hadn't heard from him, hadn't seen any sign of him in days, but he'd been there, lurking in the shadows, watching me. I packed my things that night and left, leaving behind my lease, my deposit, everything. I couldn't stay there, not after everything I'd seen. I moved across town to a building with a doorman and security cameras, hoping to finally feel safe again. But every now and then, when I look out my window, I see shadows lingering in the alleyways, figures that disappear the moment I try to get a closer look. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I can feel someone watching me. They say you never really know someone until you live with them. But I know, without a doubt, that I never really knew Tom at all. It was a Wednesday night when I saw the post. Lost cat. Injured. Last seen near Park Avenue. Please help me find my baby. The photo was of a black cat with a small patch of white on its chest, big green eyes, and a sweet, expressive face. I've always had a soft spot for animals, and I'd done some volunteer work with a local rescue. I knew how painful it was to lose a pet, so I decided to help, even though it was late and I had work in the morning. I messaged the poster right away. They replied almost instantly, thanking me profusely and providing an address. The writer, who introduced herself as Lisa, said the cat, Pickles, had been injured and was last seen in her backyard, a heavily wooded area. She needed help searching since she'd injured her foot and couldn't go into the dense trees. I assured her I'd come by, grabbed a flashlight, some treats, and headed out. As I drove through the dark streets, the whole thing felt a little surreal. There was a mist hanging in the air, thickening as I got closer to the address Lisa had provided. I wondered if maybe I should have waited until morning, but something in her messages had sounded desperate. Besides, the sooner we found the cat, the better. The house was on the edge of town, far from other homes. It was old and a little run down, with weeds creeping along the stone path and a flickering porch light casting eerie shadows. I parked in front of the house, noting how quiet it was. There wasn't another soul in sight, not a single car or porch light in any of the nearby houses. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it creaked open. Lisa was standing there, an older woman with silver hair, pulled into a loose bun. She wore a thick sweater, even though it was still warm out, and there was something slightly off in her gaze. Her eyes looked tired, almost hollow. "Thank you so much for coming," she said, her voice soft and shaky. "Pickles is all I have. I can't lose him." "Of course," I replied, putting on a reassuring smile. "Do you have any idea where he might have gone?" She pointed to the backyard, a dark wooded area that stretched far beyond the house. "I saw him run into the trees just before he got hurt. He's probably hiding, poor thing." The backyard was pitch black. I clicked on my flashlight, feeling a chill that I couldn't quite explain. I glanced back at Lisa, but she just gestured again toward the woods, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "I'll check it out," I said, trying to keep my tone light. She didn't respond, just nodded slowly as I turned and headed toward the trees. The air felt thick and heavy as I entered the woods, the only sound being the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. I called out softly, "Pickles? Here, kitty kitty," feeling a little silly, but hopeful that the cat would respond to a gentle voice. I ventured deeper into the trees, my flashlight casting long, eerie shadows. The woods were dense, the branches low and twisted, making it hard to see very far. Every few steps, I stopped and called out again, hoping to hear a faint meow or some sign of movement. Nothing. After a few minutes, I glanced back and realized I could no longer see the house. I was surrounded by trees and darkness, and the silence was oppressive. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt, like I was being watched. I kept moving, pushing away the creeping sense of dread. "Pickles?" I called again, shining my flashlight in every direction. Just then, I heard a soft rustling sound behind me. I froze, listening, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly as I turned around. The noise had come from a cluster of bushes about 10 feet away. Heart pounding, I took a step toward it, whispering, "Pickles, is that you?" The rustling stopped. I swallowed, inching closer, my flashlight trained on the spot where I'd heard the noise. Then, out of the darkness, I saw movement. Something small, a flash of black fur. I felt a rush of relief. It was Pickles. I crouched down, reaching out with a handful of treats I'd brought along. "Come here, sweetie. I'm not going to hurt you," I whispered, my voice gentle. But as I took another step forward, the fur disappeared into the shadows, slipping silently further into the woods. I followed, feeling an urgency to catch up, to save this poor cat. I could still hear the faint rustling ahead, as if it was leading me deeper into the trees. After a few minutes, the rustling stopped again. I turned in every direction, my flashlight flickering as I searched for any sign of movement. My voice shook as I called out, "Pickles?" Nothing. Just silence. A shiver ran down my spine, and I realized how far I'd come. The darkness felt thicker now, the trees pressing in around me, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward me. The air was colder, and the smell of damp earth filled my nose. Then suddenly, I heard a voice. "Help me," it whispered, barely audible, so soft that I almost thought I'd imagined it. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. It was faint, like someone far away, calling for help. I turned, shining my flashlight in every direction, but all I saw were trees. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" Silence. Then, after a few moments, I heard it again, a little louder this time, more desperate. "Help me." My pulse quickened as I tried to pinpoint the source. It sounded like it was coming from somewhere to my left, deeper into the woods. Against my better judgment, I started walking toward it, the beam of my flashlight bobbing with each step. As I ventured further, the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Please help me." My heart pounded as I reached a small clearing, the trees thinning out around me. I stopped, shining my light across the empty space, but there was no one there. "Hello?" I called again, my voice echoing in the stillness. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. Just a flash of movement, a shadow slipping behind a tree. I whipped my flashlight around, my hands shaking as I tried to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. "Help. Me?" the voice murmured, closer now. So close it felt like it was right behind me. I spun around, and my flashlight fell on a figure, a woman, barely visible in the darkness, her face obscured by tangled hair. Her clothes were torn, dirty, and she looked as though she'd been lost in the woods for days. She reached out a hand, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, you have to help me. I don't know how to get out." I took a step back, startled. "What happened? Are you hurt?" She nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving mine. "Yes, I've been trapped here. He won't let me leave." My blood ran cold. "Who won't let you leave?" But before she could answer, there was a loud snap behind me, like a branch breaking. I turned, my flashlight swinging wildly, but there was nothing there, just shadows and trees. When I looked back, the woman was gone, vanished into the darkness, as if she'd never been there. A surge of panic rose in me. I turned and began to backtrack, desperate to find my way out of the woods. My mind raced, the eerie image of the woman haunting me as I stumbled through the trees. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard the voice again, whispering, "Help me." I broke into a run, branches scratching at my arms and face as I sprinted through the woods, not caring about the noise or the direction. I just needed to get out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint light ahead. The house. I ran toward it, bursting out of the trees and into the backyard, gasping for breath. But when I looked up, the house was dark. There was no light in the windows, no sign of Lisa. I stumbled up to the door, pounding on it, shouting, "Lisa, are you there?" No answer. I tried the handle, and to my surprise, the door creaked open. Inside, the house was cold, empty, and silent. I called out for Lisa again, but there was nothing, just a hollow echo that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. As I took a step inside, I noticed something strange on the floor. There was a line of dark, muddy footprints leading from the back door to the living room. I followed them, my heart pounding as I realized they were my own. I hadn't seen them on the way in. I followed the footprints into the living room, where they stopped abruptly in the middle of the floor. My flashlight flickered, casting an eerie glow across the room, and that's when I saw it. In the center of the room, taped to the wall, was a photo. It was a picture of me taken from behind as I stood in the middle of the woods, my flashlight raised, looking for the cat. And underneath the photo, scrawled in dark, jagged letters, were the words, "Thank you for helping me." The room spun, my stomach twisting as I realized what it meant. Lisa hadn't been looking for her cat. She'd been waiting for someone to enter the woods, for someone to take her place. And now, somewhere out there, another voice would be calling for help, trapped in those dark, twisted trees. I ran out of the house, my mind reeling as I stumbled back to my car, not daring to look back at the woods. I don't know who or what was in those trees, but I knew one thing for sure. I was never going back. The ad was too tempting to ignore. Antique chair, haunted, $10, downtown pickup. I've always had a soft spot for old, unique pieces with a bit of a story to them, and the idea of a haunted chair for just $10 felt like hitting the thrift store jackpot. Plus, I thought the haunted part was a joke, an excuse for the ridiculously low price. I messaged the seller, and within minutes, he replied. He didn't say much, just told me to come by that evening to pick it up. He provided an address in a part of downtown I wasn't too familiar with. I figured it'd be some quirky hipster selling off stuff from an estate sale, so I was excited to check it out. When I got there, I was surprised. The address led me to an old, narrow house, sandwiched between two newer buildings. It looked out of place, worn down and shadowed by its taller, modern neighbors. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of life. I checked the message to make sure I had the right place, then rang the bell. After a long moment, the door opened, and a middle-aged man stood in the doorway. His face was pale and tired, with dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. "You here for the chair?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yeah, that's me. Thanks for offering it up," I replied, trying to keep the tone light. He didn't smile. Instead, he just nodded and gestured for me to follow him inside. The house was dimly lit, cluttered with old furniture and strange knickknacks that gave it an eerie atmosphere. It smelled faintly of dust and something else, something metallic and sour. We walked into a small sitting room where the chair waited, standing alone in the center of the room. It was an antique armchair, made of dark, polished wood with an elaborate, almost Gothic design. The seat was upholstered in faded red velvet, worn and frayed along the edges. The backrest was high, with intricate carvings of faces, almost demonic faces, now that I looked closely, etched into the wood. For a split second, I considered backing out. There was something about the chair, something that made me feel uneasy. But it was beautiful, and I brushed off the strange feeling. Besides, I couldn't let superstition get the best of me. "Are you sure you want to sell this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The man looked at me, his gaze intense. "I just want it gone," he said, his tone flat. "Take it, and don't let anyone sit in it." I laughed awkwardly, waiting for him to smile or say he was joking, but he just stared at me, his face blank. I quickly handed him the $10 bill, eager to get out of there. Without another word, He helped me carry the chair out to my car, and I left, feeling a little creeped out, but excited to have such an interesting piece. Once I got the chair home, I placed it in the corner of my living room. It looked beautiful there, like it had always belonged. The dark wood and deep red fabric gave the room a touch of old-world elegance, and I was thrilled with how it tied everything together. But that night, as I settled in to watch a movie, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every so often, I would glance over at the chair, almost expecting to see someone sitting in it, watching me. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. After all, I'd let the seller's haunted story get in my head. Around midnight, I turned off the lights and headed to bed. But as I lay there, I could swear I heard faint creaking noises coming from the living room, like someone shifting their weight. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there. I told myself it was just the wood settling or the floor creaking. Old houses make weird noises, right? The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy, but I went about my day, trying to ignore the strange feeling that had settled over me. When I came home that evening, I noticed that the chair was angled slightly toward the hallway, as if someone had moved it. I could have sworn I'd left it facing the window. I frowned, feeling a prickle of discomfort. Maybe I'd bumped it when I walked by, or maybe I'd just misremembered. I adjusted it back to its original position and tried to forget about it. That night, I settled on the couch with a book, and after a while, I noticed the same odd sensation from the night before. It felt like someone was watching me. I glanced at the chair, half expecting to see a figure sitting there, but it was empty. But as I looked closer, I noticed something strange. The carved faces in the wood seemed different. Their expressions had shifted, their features twisted into grotesque, almost menacing grins. I shook my head, telling myself I was just tired, that I was imagining things. Hours passed, and the feeling only grew stronger. Finally, I decided to call it a night. But as I turned off the lights and left the room, I felt a strange urge to glance back at the chair one last time. In the darkness, I could have sworn I saw a faint outline, a shadow that didn't belong, sitting there, watching me. I went to bed, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But the nightmares started that night. In my dream, I was sitting in the chair, unable to move. My arms and legs felt heavy, as if they were chained down. I could feel something cold and sharp pressing against my wrists, holding me in place. And in the shadows around me, I saw faces, dozens of faces, all watching me with hungry, gleaming eyes. They whispered, their voices low and eerie, filling my head with words I couldn't understand. And then, slowly, they began to close in, their hands reaching out, grasping, pulling me down, deeper into the darkness. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. The image of those faces burned into my mind. I shook it off as just a nightmare, but the fear lingered, gnawing at me. I avoided the living room as much as I could that day, too afraid to look at the chair. But that night, the nightmare returned, and the night after that. Every time, it was the same. I was trapped in the chair, surrounded by those faces, their cold hands pulling me down, their whispers filling my head. By the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. I was exhausted, terrified, and desperate to sleep without being haunted by that horrible dream. I decided to get rid of the chair. I'd put it back on Craigslist, give it to a thrift store, anything to get it out of my apartment. But when I went into the living room, I froze. The chair had moved. It was facing the hallway again, angled slightly toward my bedroom. And on the seat, in the center of the worn velvet, was a faint outline, like the impression of someone sitting there, waiting. My blood ran cold, and my hands shook as I backed out of the room. I knew then that this wasn't just my imagination, that whatever was in that chair was very real. I ran to my room, grabbing my phone and dialing the seller's number. I needed answers, but the phone just rang, and no one picked up. Desperate, I did a quick search online, hoping to find any information about the chair, the seller, anything that could explain what was happening. I scoured forums, antique websites, old news articles. Finally, after hours of searching, I found a local blog that mentioned the chair. According to the blog, the chair had once belonged to a wealthy widow in the 1800s. She was known for her reclusive nature and strange habits, and when she died, rumors spread that she had dabbled in dark rituals. People claimed she'd cursed the chair, saying that whoever sat in it would be trapped with her forever. The chair had passed through several owners over the years, but each one had reported strange occurrences, footsteps in empty rooms, voices in the middle of the night, the feeling of being watched. Most disturbing of all, many of them had experienced nightmares of being trapped, surrounded by shadowy figures. They'd all tried to get rid of the chair, but it always seemed to find its way back. A chill ran down my spine as I read, and I knew I had to get rid of it immediately. I grabbed the chair, hauled it out of my apartment, and took it to the nearest dumpster, leaving it there in the dark. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was safely back inside. That night, I slept peacefully for the first time in days. The nightmares stopped, and I felt a huge weight lift from my shoulders. But a week later, as I walked into my living room, my heart sank. There in the corner of the room was the chair, exactly where it had been before. And in the dim light, I could see a faint outline on the seat, like someone had just gotten up. I moved out the next day. I left everything behind, the chair, the apartment, even most of my belongings. Because deep down, I knew that no matter where I went, no matter how far I ran, that chair would always find me. And one day, I knew I'd have no choice but to sit in it.